June 25, 1876. Sergeant John Ryan of the 7th U.S. Cavalry is standing on a hillside in Montana. The summer sun hammers down on the Little Bighorn Valley below. And from somewhere, he can't tell exactly where, gunfire erupts. Not from one direction, from everywhere, from thickets he can't see into, from ravines he never noticed, from positions that military theory says shouldn't exist. Ryan is holding a Springfield Model 1873, the finest rifle the U.S. Army has ever produced up to that moment. It fires the .45-70 government cartridge, a 405-grain lead bullet, black powder loaded, carrying enough force to drop a bison at 500 yards. On paper, Ryan and his men hold every advantage. But battlefields don't read paper. Within a few hours, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and more than 260 American soldiers will be dead on those hills. It will become one of the worst military disasters in American history. But this isn't a story about Custer. It's not about command failures, or courage, or recklessness. This is a story about a cartridge designed in 1873 during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. A cartridge that watched the American empire expand from the Pacific to the Atlantic. A cartridge the military declared obsolete, that technology left behind, and that was pronounced dead not once, not twice, but at least 3 times. And a cartridge that, as of 2023, 150 years after it was born, still appears in U.S. and Navy procurement documents. Why? That's the best question I want to answer today. Because the answer isn't really about ammunition. It's about a mistake that every organization, every institution, every one of us keeps making and keeps paying for. To understand why the .45-70 was created, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1873. The Civil War had ended 8 years earlier, and it left behind a lesson no one in the military could forget. The rifled musket, a barrel with spiral grooves cut into it, had completely transformed the nature of warfare. Before rifled barrels, infantry accuracy topped out at maybe 50 to 100 yards on a good day. With rifling, that number jumped to 300, even 500 yards. The result? Civil War casualties reached levels nobody had anticipated. Both sides combined lost more than 600. Zuzoed men, a number higher than all American combat deaths in every other war combined, from the Revolution through Korea. The lesson, as the generals saw it, was clear. The future belonged to accurate, long-range marksmanship. Not fast fire, accurate fire. This was the environment in which Springfield Armory, the Army's primary weapons development facility, sat down to design a new standard cartridge, and they set very specific requirements. The bullet had to be heavy enough to maintain a stable trajectory at distance. It had to carry enough energy to wound seriously at several hundred yards. It had to function reliably in any weather. And it had to be manufacturable with the industrial technology of the time. The result was the .45-70 government. 45 is the caliber, bullet diameter of roughly 0.45 inches, or about 11.5 millimeters. 70 is the powder charge, 70 grains of black powder. A 405-grain lead bullet leaving the muzzle at approximately 1,350 feet per second. By today's standards, that sounds slow. But don't be fooled. In 1873, this was a formidable round. Army training manuals discussed volley fire at distances approaching 1,000 yards. The Springfield Model 1884 later featured a precisely calibrated rear sight, with detailed elevation markings for each engagement distance. These weren't decorative features. They were evidence of a deep, genuine belief. Future battlefields would be orderly engagements at measurable distances between trained infantry formations. And viewed through that lens, the .45-70 was a perfect solution. But there was another concern the officers of that era discussed frequently. One that sounds strange to modern ears. They were afraid of fast fire. Not in a technical sense. They were worried about logistics. Think about it. In 1873, there were no trucks, no resupply helicopters. Ammunition had to be carried by horse and wagon over dirt roads stretching hundreds of miles. A soldier could only carry so many rounds. When they ran out, resupply wasn't always possible. During the Civil War, officers had watched units burn through their entire ammunition supply in a single engagement. The consequences were catastrophic. So many generals concluded. A slow-firing rifle that forces soldiers to aim carefully is a feature, not a flaw. The Springfield Trapdoor, the rifle chambered for .45-70, embodied that philosophy perfectly. Every shot required a complete sequence. Open the breech, extract the spent case, insert a fresh cartridge, close the action, aim, fire. There was no way to spray and pray with this weapon. It demanded discipline. The Americans weren't alone in thinking this way. The British believed in the Martini Henry. The Germans were developing increasingly sophisticated Mauser systems. Across Europe, armies were investing in accurate, slow-firing, long-range rifles. An entire generation of military planners agreed the future belonged to the disciplined marksman, not the fast shooter. And then they took that philosophy to a real battlefield. There's an important detail I need to emphasize right now. The officers who designed the 45-70 system were not designing a weapon for frontier wars in the American West. They barely thought about that at all. Their real concern was, if the United States had to fight an industrial power, Britain, Germany, France, what kind of rifle would it need? That was the question they were answering. And the .45-70 was a reasonable answer. The problem was, the war actually being fought was not that war. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes across the American West hadn't attended military academies. They hadn't read European doctrine, and they had absolutely no interest in standing 500 yards away, exchanging measured volleys with U.S. soldiers. They fought in a completely different way. They knew the terrain literally, every creek, every rock formation, every bush tall enough to conceal a man. They moved with extraordinary speed. They chose the time and location of every engagement. And, most importantly, they never offered the kind of target the Springfield had been designed to hit. A rifle optimized to shoot someone at 500 yards becomes considerably less impressive when the fight happens at 50. And at 50 yards, in terrain broken up by ravines and dense brush, when a target appears for 2 seconds and vanishes again. What you need isn't 500-yard accuracy. You need to put multiple rounds downrange in the shortest time possible. And this is what made Little Bighorn particularly devastating. Many Lakota and Cheyenne warriors were carrying repeating rifles, Winchesters, Henry rifles, Spencer carbines, acquired through trade, purchase, or previous engagements. These weapons weren't more powerful than the Springfield. They weren't more accurate at distance. But they could fire multiple shots before needing to reload. In close range, chaotic combat, that advantage was decisive. While a U.S. soldier fired one shot and spent 5 to 10 seconds reloading, a warrior with a Winchester could fire 5 to 7 rounds. Multiply that across hundreds of men on both sides, and you start to understand why the day ended the way it did. But I want to stop here and make something clear. This is not a story about the U.S. Army being stupid. The men who designed the .45-70 were not fools. The officers at Little Bighorn were not cowards. They were fighting with a tool designed for a completely different kind of war. And that is the real danger. Not having a bad tool, but having a good tool built for the wrong problem. Here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. Army looked at Little Bighorn, looked at dozens of other frontier engagements, and reached a conclusion. Change the rifle. In 1892, 16 years after Little Bighorn, the Army officially retired the Springfield Trapdoor. They transitioned to the Krag-Jurgensen, a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round magazine, chambered in .30-40 Krag, firing smokeless powder. This was a genuine technological leap. Soldiers could now fire 5 shots without reloading. Flatter trajectory, greater range, no telltale smoke cloud. The U.S. Army congratulated itself. They had learned the lesson. They had modernized. 6 years later, at a lake in northern Minnesota, they were about to discover that learning a lesson and solving a problem are not the same thing. October 5, 1898. Major Melville Wilkinson leads 77 soldiers from the 3rd U.S. Infantry onto 2 small steamboats on Leech Lake, Minnesota. The mission sounds straightforward. Arrest an Ojibwe leader known as Buganigashig, or Hole in the Day, for resisting government efforts to control logging operations on reservation land. Not a major campaign, not a dangerous assignment. And this time, unlike Little Bighorn, they are carrying modern weapons, Krag-Jurgensens, smokeless ammunition, multi-round magazines. Everything that military doctrine of the era considered advanced. They land at Sugar Point, set up camp, start cooking. Rifles are stacked nearby. Then a shot rings out. The exact circumstances are disputed to this day. Army reports suggested it might have been accidental. Ojibwe accounts told a different story. It doesn't matter, what happened next does. Within seconds, rifle fire poured out of the surrounding forest. And the U.S. Army, holding their modern Krag-Jurgensens, found themselves replaying exactly what had happened 22 years earlier at Little Bighorn. The enemy was invisible. The terrain blocked all observation. No clear battle lines, no visible formations. Just gunfire coming from positions that couldn't be located. And here's the part that military historians have thought hard about. This time, smokeless powder had eliminated one minor advantage the Army once had. The white smoke from a Springfield at least revealed where the shooter was. Standing. With the Krag both sides, fired without giving away their positions. But the Ojibwe fighters knew that forest to the centimeter. They knew how to move without being seen. They knew the angles. They knew where soldiers would have sat. The Army knew none of that. By the time the fighting ended, 6 soldiers were dead. 10 more were wounded. Major Wilkinson was hit multiple times, but continued directing his men until he went down. The mission, arresting Hole in the Day, failed completely. He was never captured. And Ojibwe casualties? By most accounts, near zero. With more modern weapons, more modern doctrine, and nearly identical results to Little Bighorn. Why? Because the Army had changed the rifle. But they hadn't changed the thing that mattered more. Their understanding of the actual battlefield. They spent 20 years focused on weapons. The battlefield spent 20 years focused on terrain. They were looking at 2 completely different things. This is where the story of the 4570 becomes genuinely interesting, because while the U.S. Army continued modernizing, from Krag to .3006, then to 7.62 NATO, then to 5.56 millimeters, the old cartridge they'd retired refused to disappear. And the reason it didn't disappear will tell you something profound about technology, and about how human beings actually solve problems. When the Army abandoned the 4570, something unexpected happened. Hunters didn't. I want you to put yourself in the position of a hunter in Alaska, around 1910. You don't care about NATO. You don't care about Army logistics systems. You don't care about how many rounds 1,000 soldiers need to carry across a continent. You care about one thing. If a 600-kilogram grizzly bear comes out of the brush 20 yards away, you have time for one shot. Just one. Will that shot stop the bear? When you ask that question, you arrive at a very different answer than any military procurement officer. You don't need long range. You don't need a flat trajectory. You don't need fast follow-up shots. You need immediate stopping power at close distance. And by that standard, the .4570 didn't have many competitors. A 405-grain bullet at even moderate velocity carries tremendous momentum. When it hits a target, it doesn't create a small, neat hole. It produces a different kind of damage. Massive, immediate, requiring very little in the way of ideal conditions. Especially important in dense forest, where visibility is limited and engagement distances rarely exceed 50 yards. What military planners called outdated, low velocity, heavy bullet was precisely what hunters needed. So while the Army ran toward the future, hunters quietly kept the past alive, and the market listened. Marlin kept producing lever-action rifles, chambered in .4570. Ruger introduced single-shot rifles capable of handling significantly higher pressures than the old Springfield. And ammunition manufacturers started asking, what if we loaded this hotter? This is what turned the .4570's story into something truly remarkable. The original Springfield Trapdoor was designed around black powder pressures, 1873 technology. But modern rifles are built from far superior steel. Metallurgy in the year 2000 bears no resemblance to metallurgy in 1873. So if you take a modern rifle, use the old cartridge design, but load it with modern propellants, you can push that 405-grain bullet from 1,350 feet per second to well over 2,000. Energy nearly doubles. Close-range stopping power becomes extraordinary. Bear hunters in Alaska started calling the .4570 life insurance. Not the rifle they wanted to shoot all day. Not the rifle for routine situations. The rifle they wanted nearby on the day everything went wrong. And this is the central point of the entire story. The problems the .4570 solved never went away. In 1873 or 1973, these things remained constant. Grizzly bears still weighed 600 kilograms. Alaskan forests were still dense. Visibility was still limited. And when a bear decided to charge, you still had only a few seconds. Technology changed. Biological and physical reality did not. Now we come to the part that even many military history enthusiasts don't know about. Forget the Alaskan wilderness for a moment. We're going to see. Picture this scenario. Two ships separated by several hundred yards of rough water. A storm is building. One vessel needs to pass a line to the other to conduct a rescue. Throw it by hand. Not enough distance, and the wind takes it. Send a small boat? Too dangerous in heavy seas. You need a device that can launch a messenger line across that gap, in bad weather, with near absolute reliability. This was the problem the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard had been solving for decades, the line-throwing gun. Sounds simple. The engineering reality is surprisingly complex. The device has to generate enough force to project the line a useful distance. It has to function after years of storage in a saltwater environment. It has to be simple enough for a non-specialist sailor to operate correctly in an emergency. And above all, it has to work the first time every time. Because if it doesn't work during an actual rescue, people die. When engineers sat down to design these systems, they evaluated a wide range of options, and they reached a surprising conclusion. The old .45-70 case, the one the Army had retired at the end of the 19th century, was nearly perfect for this application. Large enough to contain sufficient propellant charge to generate the needed force. Mechanically simple enough to be reliable. Durable enough to withstand harsh maritime environments. And straightforward enough to manufacture efficiently. So while generations of infantry soldiers moved on to .3006, then 7.62 NATO, then 5.56 mm, the .4570 case quietly found a new home in the U.S. Navy's arsenal. Not to shoot anyone, to save people. And this is the moment I want you to actually stop and sit with. I have in front of me a U.S. military technical document. The date on it, March 3, 2023. In a U.S. Navy procurement document, referencing a line-throwing system built around a design descended from the .45 Savondy cartridge case. Let that number settle. 150 years.